Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. I'm Kirti Sophia Purnachan, and in today's session we'll be continuing the poem Anecdote of the Jar by Wallace Stevens. This is part 2. In the previous class we have already learned stanza 1, so in this class we'll be moving on to stanza 2. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a pot in air. The wilderness rose up to it. This line gives us more detail about how the jar is influencing the wilderness. The wilderness means trees, branches, vines, birds, skunks, rabbits, whatever are there around the hill is being described as rising up to the hill and the jar. It can be taken as either the hill itself or the jar on top of the hill. If we consider it to be the hill, reference to trees as moving upward to the top as if it were actually rising. The hill is making the wilderness rise. On another level, though it can also be the jar that sits on top of the hill, this brings in a more abstract option. The line as not only describing a rise in altitude but a rise in character. As a man-made object seen as having control over its natural surroundings, it makes us question whether the jar is seen as empowered over nature, or perhaps the wilderness is seen as on the same level, equal in importance as this mundane human invention. The next line, and sprawled around no longer wild. Not only does the wilderness seem to be drawn to this jar like some kind of magnet, but the jar has made the wilderness no longer wild. Men would neatly manicure and order the wilderness if it were no longer wild, yet it sprawls out like a person. In that way, the wilderness is treated as human through further personification. The wilderness is no longer wild. Possibly this is because the jar has intruded. There is something man-made in the wilderness now, tarnishing its purity. It could also be a statement about how men and man-made objects often overtake the wild and the natural. In this line, sprawled means spread out over a large area in an untidy or irregular way. The next line, the jar was round upon the ground. We return from the description of how the wilderness interacts with the jar to a description of the jar itself. The description of the jar, which is simply round and on the ground, makes it all the more amazing that the wilderness has been conquered, or at least affected by it. Note that this line is basically a repetition of line 2. We are hearing for the second time that it, like most jar, is round. Instead of hearing that it is on a hill, this time we find out that it's on the ground. Also, we should note the contrast of sound in this line. We've got round and ground echoing the around from the line before. So through this jar commands the wilderness, at least taming it so that it's no longer wild, possibly rounding out its rough edges. This rounding out itself is like the jar out of place jarring. The last line of the stanza, and tall and of a pot in air. The jar is tall, which probably means it's just a little longer than other jars. Of a pot in air, the word of can stand in for the word like, which would make this phrase a simile, like like a pot of air. That's the change that comes, and that's how it becomes a simile. Consider the different meanings of the word port. The word port could mean a harbor, the place where ships come in and out, delivering people and goods across water. But port can really be any entry place where people or things come in and out. Port can also be used to describe the way that someone carries himself or herself. It also makes us think of the word portly, which means heavy or large. If we think of the jar as a port in air, as in a harbor or entryway, we can still think of it in two ways. One way would be to think of the air itself as the ships that come in and out of a typical port. Certainly, in the wilderness outdoor, air would come in and out of the jar. We can also think of the air being like water for a normal port instead of being in the water. This jar is a place where, in the air, commerce can happen and things can be exchanged. In this way, perhaps most importantly, it's a way to access a new place or world. If we think of port as in portly or heavy, though we've already got the basis to think of it as round and tall, the jar has a heaviness that shows that it, although being inanimate, bears itself with pride. So, in this stanza, we can assume that the line combines these meanings that I'm going to say right now. The jar is a port for the commercial world to enter the wilderness and possibly vice versa. It's also quite round and heavy, unlike the wilderness, which we connect with barely scraping together its survival, flourishing but thin. However you read it, the jar is again in sharp contrast with the wilderness that surrounds it. So that's all for today. I hope today's session was fruitful for you all. If you liked this video, do give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Once again, thank you so much. See you again in the next class. Bye-bye.